And now we are thrilled to introduce our Father Charlie Curry Memorial Keynote speaker. But first, who was Father Charlie Curry? Following the horrific murders of 6 of his fellow Jesuits, their housekeeper and her daughter, on November 16, 1989, Father Curry served as a liaison to the U.S. congressional investigation into the murders over the subsequent years. He took great risks to uncover the truth of Salvadoran and U.S. government complicity in the deaths of the UCA martyrs. Honoring Father Curry's legacy, who helped begin the gatherings that eventually became the Teach-In, we welcome our first keynote speaker, Father Greg Boyle.
Father Gregory Boyle is a Jesuit priest and founder of Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles, the largest gang intervention, rehabilitation, and re-entry program in the world. Born and raised in Los Angeles, Father Boyle served as a pastor of Dolores Mission Church in Boyle Heights from 1986 to 1992, where he witnessed the devastating impact of gang violence on his community. He and his parish and community members adopted what was a radical approach at the time: treat gang members as human beings. In 1988, they started what would eventually become Homeboy Industries, which employs and trains former gang members in a range of social enterprises, as well as provides critical services to thousands of individuals who walk through its doors every year seeking a better life. Father Boyle is the author of the 2010 New York Times-bestseller, Tattoos on the Heart, The Power of Boundless Compassion, along with numerous other books. He has received many awards for his ministry, including, but not limited to, the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2024. Let's give a warm welcome to Father Boyle.
Thank you. Thank you. When I got that presidential medal, a homie texted me and said, "I heard you got some presidential pardon or some shit." Yeah, something like that. I am humbled to be here with you, especially I knew Charlie Curry, and who began this venture. And along with Bob Holstein, both of them are looking down on us. And Loretta Holstein is live streaming, watching. And so I thank them for their vision. I look out at all of you and I think about what Martin Luther King used to say about church, that it's not the place you come to, it's the place you go from. Eventually you're going to go from here. And you are going to imagine a circle of compassion, and then you're going to imagine nobody standing outside of it. And you're going to go from here, and you are going to decide to dismantle the barriers that exclude. And you will imagine and nurture into being a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. A place of tenderness, where everybody is welcomed. You will go from here knowing the marrow of the gospel, and you will choose to decide to take seriously what Jesus took seriously: 4 things: inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, and compassionate acceptance. You will go from here and you'll stand at the margins, because that's the only way they'll ever get erased, is if we stand out at them. And you will stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, and you're going to go from here and stand with those whose dignity has been denied and those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And together we're going to be able to press on and go from here to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out, to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and to stand with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And we will go from here because there's something urgent happening, and we need to resist with the power of our love, knowing that we are all siblings of infinite love. And we will go from here and be mindful of how we need to put one loving foot in front of the next. The poet Galway Kinnell says, now could be the moment when we fall apart or when we become whole. And that's part of what this Ignatian family has always been dedicated to since 1989, when our brothers and sisters were assassinated in El Salvador. We choose to become whole. And we brace ourselves because the world will accuse us of wasting our time at the margins. That always happens. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, for in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. And you'll go from here and people will be heard. And so we have to represent a spacious and expansive God as we go from here. We don't want our God to become puny. We don't want to settle for a partial God. For 40 years, I've walked with gang members, and it's been the privilege of my life, and indeed privileged to be joined on this trip by Brian and Anthony, who will speak to you in 2 workshops to come. But it is the privilege of my life to walk with them and to somehow want to learn from them and be reached by them and understand the kind of God who loves us without measure and without regret. For all those 40 years, I say Mass, in detention facilities, juvenile halls and jails and probation camps. And I was at a San Fernando Juvenile Hall, and I was saying Mass there and there were 200 gang members in the auditorium, and I was wearing my stole and my alb, and I was sitting on a little raised platform, and the homies got up to do the readings, and so they have these sheets that have the readings in English and in Spanish, and the first homie got up and read from the Hebrew Bible, and I closed my eyes. I wanted to just listen to the word being proclaimed, and I rested that sheet on my lap. And the second guy got up to do the responsorial psalm, and there was kind of an overabundance of confidence in his voice, and he gets up and he says, "The Lord is exhausted." And I said, "What the hell?" And it was, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. Because the exhausted God connects to our invitation to go from this place and be generous, to choose to be in the world who God is, loving and kind and compassionate. And so we want to go from here and stay always anchored in the present moment, knowing that love is always the next thing to do. But we're too busy lamenting what happened yesterday, or we're anxious about tomorrow, and we lose the present moment that invites us to delight and to be curious and to lean in and to avoid judgment. I had a homie named Caesar come into my office at Homeboy Industries, and I'd known him since he was a little kid in the projects, and he was working in the bakery now, a Homeboy Bakery, which is just in our headquarters, just behind my office, and he had a hairnet on, and he had an apron, black apron that said Homeboy Bakery, and it was dusted with flour, and he stands in front of my desk, and he says, "I need your divided attention." And I said, "You are in luck, because that is exactly what you're going to be getting." And he says, "I love baking bread, and And I bring it home. I bring loaves of bread home to my family, and my mom, she's proud of me, and my kids, they're not ashamed of me. And you know who I have to thank for this job. And I said, well, gosh. Who? And he looks at me strange and he says, well, God, of course. Oh, yes, no, sure. That's right, that would be God. Wait a minute, you thought I was going to say you. I said, no, gosh. God's number one. He said, you are so lucky we're not living in them Genesis days. I'm sorry, them Genesis days? He goes, yeah, because God would have had struck down your ass already by now. And we both leaned in and we delighted and found ourselves anchored in the present moment. And you don't want to miss it when it happens. We won't be able to go from here and to put one loving foot in front of the next unless we choose to be anchored right here and now and delighting. Many years ago, I would ride my bike in the middle of the night in the housing projects where I was pastor, and I would patrol the 8 gangs at war with each other in the projects. And I can remember coming upon this one gang, and the older homies would come forward and we'd be talking. And this little guy came up right in between all the older guys. I found out his name was Danny. He was 13 years old. And he always made a point to lift up his shirt to show that he had a gun tucked into the front of his pants. And he made a solemn vow to me once. He said, I will never step foot in Homeboy Industries. So I only knew him from the streets, and I knew him from juvenile hall and probation camp. And finally, at 18, he went to prison for 2 years. And in gang recovery, they say it takes what it takes: the birth of a son, the death of a friend, a long stretch in prison. For Danny, he got out of prison to discover that his mother had 6 months to live. She had pancreatic cancer. I'd go to his house and I watched how tender this guy was with her. All the more remarkable because she was quite torturous towards him. One day I anointed her and said a blessing prayer. A week later, she died. A week later, I buried her. And a week after that, he walks into Homeboy Industries for the very first time. And I watch him work side by side with guys I know he used to shoot at. And I watched him inhabit the truth of who he was. And I watched him, as we say at Homeboy, laugh from the stomach. One day he comes into my office and he begins very dramatically. He says, what happened to me yesterday has never happened to me in my whole life. And he tells me after work at 5, he goes across the street to the red line to take it east to go home. And he says the train was packed, but he managed to get a seat. And standing right in front of him, holding onto a pole, he said was a medio pedo guy, a guy who was a little bit drunk. Older vato, had tattoos on his hand. He didn't know who he was. And Danny's wearing a sweatshirt that says Homeboy Industries, jobs, not jails. And the little bit drunk guy sees the sweatshirt and he goes, hey, you work there? And Danny nods. Is it any good? And Danny shrugs and he says, well, it helped me. In fact, I don't think I'm ever going to go back to prison because of this place. And then Danny stands and he fishes out a piece of paper from his pocket and he has a pen and he carefully writes the address of Homeboy Industries on the piece of paper. And as he's telling me the story, he says, I couldn't believe I knew the address by heart. And he hands it to the guy and he sees him and he says, you come see us. We'll help you. And the guy receives the piece of paper and he sees Danny. And he says, thank you. And the train stops and the guy gets off and Danny sits down. Now he returns to that earlier refrain. What happened to me next has never happened to me in my life. Everyone on the train was staring at me. Everyone on the train was nodding at me. Everyone on the train was smiling at me. And now he can barely speak. And for the first time in my life, I felt admired. And we looked at each other and we wept, because I don't know what we're supposed to do. Everyone who walks into our office at Homeboy comes barricaded behind a wall of shame and disgrace, and the only thing that can scale that wall is tenderness. We go from this place eventually knowing that tenderness is the highest form of spiritual maturity. We go from this place and we know that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. We go from this place knowing that if it is true that the traumatized are likely to cause trauma, then it has to be equally true that a cherished person will be able to find their way to the joy there is in cherishing themselves and others. Because systems change when people change, and people change when they are cherished. So for 40 years, I say all these masses in all these detention facilities, and then I raced back to Dolores Mission, where I was pastor for a time and where our Jesuit community is located. And so I'll say 2 masses in detention facilities, and I race back. My Saturdays always look the same, a 1 o'clock baptism, 2 o'clock quinceañera, where a girl turns 15, 3 o'clock wedding, 4 o'clock exorcism. Just checking to see if you're still listening. I've actually never done one of those. But so I raced back, and it was like 25 minutes to 1 in my baptism, and I figured, well, I have time to race to my office. And so I go there, and I'm going through the mail, and a woman walks in. Her name is Lisa. I find out she's like 36 years old. She's a gang member, a felon, heavily tattooed, heroin addict, very much engaged in human trafficking. And this is the first time she's ever stepped foot in my office. And now it's 20 minutes to my 1 o'clock baptism. And the homies call her La Gritona because she's always screaming. And she's screaming at the guy at the bar next door who tosses her out to the street daily. She screams into a payphone, "Just let me stay tonight." And this is the first time she's ever stepped foot in our office. And she comes into my inner sanctum, and she looks at the photographs on the wall, and she sits down, and she launches right in. "I need help." Ooh, I've been to like 50 rehabs. I'm known all over, nationwide. And then she takes this detour. "I went to Catholic schools all my life. I even graduated from Sacred Heart High School in Lincoln Heights." And then she gets still. In fact, the first time I started to use heroin was right after I graduated. And I've been trying to stop since the moment I began. And I watched as her head leaned against the wall behind her, and her eyes became like 2 ponds, water rising to meet its edges and spilling over. And she cried, and I let her cry until finally she leveled her gaze at me, and she said with great deliberation, "I am a disgrace." And suddenly her shame met mine, because when I had seen her step into my office that afternoon, I had mistaken her for an interruption And we resist by knowing that loving is our true self. And we resist by knowing that loving is our home. And we resist what we need to resist by knowing that we will never be homesick because we know who we are. And it will enable us to step away from our own self-absorption so we can take seriously what Jesus took seriously. Now could be the moment when we fall apart or we become whole. At Homeboy, we're allergic to holding the bar up and asking homies to measure up, mainly because our exhausted God never does this with us. Instead, we hold the mirror up and we tell people the truth, that you are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. And then you watch folks at the margins inhabit that truth. They become that truth, and no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out, and death can't touch it because it's huge. But you have to reach in and you have to dismantle these messages of shame and disgrace. In the Acts of the Apostles, it has this one odd line, and it says, "And awe came upon everyone." And it suggests that the measure of health in any community at all, including this one, may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So many years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia, and it was what we called in those days a gang in-service. And 600 social workers commandeer a hotel ballroom, and they sign in and they get credits, and from 9 to 5 they have keynotes and breakout sessions and workshops. And they learn that, no hopeful kid has ever joined a gang in the history of the world. And they learn that no kid is seeking anything when he joins one. He's always fleeing something. And so we talk about how do we infuse hope to kids for whom hope is foreign. How do we help heal the traumatized? How do we deliver mental health services in a timely and culturally appropriate way? Things like that. I had done a lot of them during the decade of death, 88 to 98. So I agreed, figured I'd do a keynote. I bought my plane ticket. And a week before I was to fly, I pull out the letter originally inviting me, and to my horror, I discover that I am to be the only speaker from 9 to 5 all damn day. And I said to myself what the homies often say, "Oh, hell no, I'm not going to be the only speaker." So I call in 2 trainees, like these 2 guys who are in our 18-month training program, Andre, an African-American gang member, and Jose, and they'd been 9 months into our training program. They were from enemy gangs. I sat them down and I said, "Look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time, because we got a long-ass day to fill." Well, I had never heard their stories, and Jose gets up first, and he was like 25 years old at the time. Gang member, shot caller, been to prison, felon, tattooed. At that juncture, we have 14 social enterprises at Homeboy, but we're a lot of departments, tattoo removal and legal and wellness. And he kind of glommed onto our substance use disorder team. He became a very valued member there. He was a man solid in his own recovery. Now he's helping younger homies and homegirls with their addiction issues. So not only shot caller, gang member, prisoner, he also had a long stretch as a homeless man, even longer stretch as a heroin addict. So he gets up in front of 600 social workers. I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, "Why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me." Well, 600 social workers audibly gasped. And then he says, "It sounds way worser in Spanish." And they did what you just did. And then he continued, "I think I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks up to an orphanage and she knocks on the door, and the guy comes to the door and she says, 'I found this kid.' And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day, my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school each day, because the first t-shirt, the blood would seep through. The second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. "Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts?" Then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion. And he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, "I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds?" And awe came upon everyone. As you go from here, the measure of your compassion lies not in your service of those on the margins, but only in your willingness to see yourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. And Jose finished telling his story, and every single person in that ballroom stood and gave him a standing ovation. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any interest in. Kinship and connection, community of cherished belonging. Now is the moment when we could fall apart, or we could become whole. Eventually, you will go from this gathering and stand at the margins in confidence that they'll only get erased if you go out to them. And you will imagine a circle of compassion, and then you will imagine nobody standing outside that circle. And you will go from here determined to resist by being loving, because you know that is the only thing that can dismantle the barriers that exclude. And you will go from here and you will take seriously what Jesus took seriously: inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, and compassionate acceptance. And here's the truth of everybody in this room. You gave up a long time ago caring if anybody accuses you of wasting your time at the margins. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you.